Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 16, April to June, 1932.
American control of the situation in European waters had apparently been firmly established when the arrival at Madeira on April 15th of the fast steamers Nagasaki Maru and Shanghai Maru suddenly put a new aspect on affairs. The two ships stayed only long enough to fuel and complete with fresh water and stores before proceeding on their voyage to London. The George Washington, duly apprised of their movements by the U.S. Intelligence Service, was on the lookout for them and sighted their smoke some 80 miles to the southwest of Cape St. Vincent. She rapidly closed with them at a speed of 18 knots and was not surprised when they turned tail and made off to the westward. No suspicion appears to have been entertained that the enemy ships were armed and rendered still more formidable by the installation of up-to-date fire control arrangements. Their guns were cleverly concealed behind dummy deckhouses when not in action. The Japanese steamers allowed the George Washington to overhaul them slowly until she was within a little over 12,000 yards, whereupon they so increased speed that no further advantage could be gained by the pursuer. The American vessel opened fire with her forward 6-inch guns, but found the range too great for accurate shooting. To her amazement, the Japanese replied with telling effect, their well-judged salvos quickly dismounting one of the George Washington's guns and starting a fire forward. Turning about to bring her other guns into action, the American ship presented her full broadside to the enemy, offering a big target for their rapid salvos, which demolished the forward funnel and the navigating bridge. Under this storm of fire, the remaining American guns were quickly knocked out, and the great ship was unable to send a single shot at her antagonists. These now approached closer, steaming round their hapless victim and pounding her mercilessly until she was in flames fore and aft, while few of her complement above the waterline had escaped injury. Her radio cabin was demolished at an early stage, the last message dispatched being to the effect that she was in action with two enemy ships from whose fire she was suffering severely. On receipt of this startling news, the Mount Vernon, which was at Lisbon, proceeded at her utmost speed to the last reported position of the George Washington. That steamer, when sighted, was found to be completely disabled and burning furiously, so the newcomer found she must cope unaided with two opponents of equal speed and heavier armament. In these circumstances, the captain of the Mount Vernon deemed it wise to beat a retreat, since by so doing he drew the enemy away from his helpless consort and towards the Leviathan, which his radio calls must soon bring to his assistance. This stage of the action was protracted, as neither of the Japanese ships, with their bottoms fouled by the passage through the tropics, proved capable of catching the 20-knot Mount Vernon, but they were able to keep her in sight until evening, when she ran into the port of Corunna in the northwest of Spain. Here she was blockaded for some hours, until next day she received news by radio of the Leviathan's approach. Anchor was then weighed, and the Mount Vernon boldly attacked the blockading vessels, closing the range in order to use her guns with better effect. Though she succeeded in this, it was found that the Japanese shooting was more accurate, as in addition to their superior weapons and fire control installation, their guns' crews were picked men. Still, the Mount Vernon was able to score several hits in spite of the punishment she was herself receiving, and her men were soon cheered by the appearance of the gigantic Leviathan racing down from the northward. It is possible the battle might have ended differently, but for a fresh factor which was now brought into play by the Japanese. The action had developed into two single combats, the Mount Vernon fighting the Nagasaki Maru, while the Leviathan engaged the Shanghai Maru, both Americans doing their utmost to close the range in order to neutralize their opponent's advantage in armament. To some extent they succeeded, as the speed of both enemy ships now began to fall off. Nevertheless, both the Leviathan and the Mount Vernon were suffering numerous casualties, and it proved impossible to subdue the flames that broke out after almost every hit with high explosive shell. With her speed of 23 knots, the Leviathan was the first to get to really close quarters, when she had the satisfaction of seeing the Shanghai Maru suddenly veer off her course, describe an erratic segment of a circle, and approach the U.S. liner broadside to broadside, to all appearance out of control. Yet actually this proved to be a clever ruse on the part of the Japanese captain, who thus made an opportunity to discharge 2 torpedoes at the huge hull of his adversary. Their track was seen from the Leviathan's bridge too late to avoid them by use of the helm, and both exploded in quick succession amidships, tearing gigantic rents in the starboard side between the second and third funnels. With water pouring into the stokeholds, the ship at once began to lose speed, a circumstance of which the Shanghai Maru was quick to take advantage, drawing out of range before she could receive further punishment from the Leviathan's guns. All this time, the Mount Vernon and Nagasaki Maru had been pounding away at each other on more or less level terms, for a lucky shot had crippled the Japanese ship's steering gear, throwing her out of her course and disconcerting the aim of her gunners until the emergency hand wheel could be manned. But by now the Mount Vernon herself had suffered severely, and when the Shanghai Maru joined her sister, this reinforcement turned the scale. A further gallant attempt to close the range only resulted in an overwhelming fire being concentrated on the forecastle of the Mount Vernon. Her decks were plowed up, and half the bridge was blown away, together with much other superstructure, in the ruins of which the forward guns and their crews were buried. A dash was made for Spanish territorial waters, but the Shanghai Maru had already contrived to edge away in that direction, and steaming ahead of the Mount Vernon, so that the latter's stern guns would not bear, she kept up a fire so hot that the American liner was soon in a deplorable plight. Her foremast went by the board, and trailing alongside was drawn into the wake, fouling the propellers and thus destroying all chance of escape. Her 2 enemies now took up positions from which they poured in a methodical and devastating fire. In this extremity, the survivors of the Mount Vernon had no choice but to surrender, and a white flag was hoisted at the mainmast as a signal to the Japanese ships to cease fire. A boat immediately sped across from the Shanghai Maru. Her sister apparently had none left undamaged, the Japanese officer in charge demanding unconditional submission. As there was no possibility of help arriving, these terms were perforce accepted, whereupon an armed guard took possession of the crippled American liner, while the Shanghai Maru steamed off to ascertain what had become of the Leviathan. She found the great ship drifting helplessly, with a pronounced list to starboard. Passing neutral steamers offered their assistance, but it was considered dangerous to attempt towing, lest it should cause further bulkheads to give way. So a Norwegian steamer stood by in readiness to take off the Leviathan's crew in case of need, while the huge liner continued to drift in towards the coast. She eventually drove ashore close to Cape Finisterre, and despite all efforts at salvage, became a total wreck, the largest ship lost throughout the war. The George Washington, after being towed for a long distance by a French tug from Casablanca, broke adrift in heavy weather and went to pieces on the Morocco coast. The Nagasaki Maru and Shanghai Maru took the Mount Vernon into Vigo, where all 3 were busy for some days in repairing damages. No interference was to be feared from the President Madison and President Pierce, these ships having received radio instructions from Washington to do nothing until reinforcements were available. Since both vessels were inferior in force to those which had already been defeated, it would obviously have been folly to have allowed them to take the offensive. For the moment, therefore, the Japanese naval staff had scored a striking and unexpected success, due entirely to the provision shown in making the utmost use of the best material that could be found. But apart from its moral effect, very little permanent advantage was gained from this stroke, for American operations against Japanese trade had already inflicted severe losses which could not be recouped. As an example of hard-fought dueling between armed merchant vessels, the events which have just been described were practically unique. In the War of 1914-18, the action in the South Atlantic between the Carmania and Cap Trafalgar, and that in the North Sea between the Alcantara and Grafe, afford the nearest parallels. Perhaps the most striking feature of this battle in the Atlantic was the remarkable capacity which the Japanese ships showed for withstanding punishment. It is believed that the Japanese naval authorities had inspired the original design of the Nagasaki Maru and Shanghai Maru so that their construction in some respects approached the cruiser model. No other supposition adequately explains their astonishing powers of resistance to gunfire. A more remote field of operations now claims our attention. Since the Battle of Rotuma, described in the preceding chapter, all had gone smoothly with the preparations for the seizure of Truk. Troop movements between California, Hawaii, and Samoa had proceeded with regularity, and a sufficient number of trained soldiers had been assembled at the last named point. All was in readiness for the next and most important step, when early in May, news was received of an alarming insurrection in the Hawaiian group. Whether it originated locally or was inspired from Tokyo is a question which has never been satisfactorily settled. But there is no doubt that by some means a quantity of rifles had been smuggled into the islands and conveyed to a central point in Oahu, whence they were gradually distributed among the large Japanese population of the group, estimated at that date to number nearly 140,000 out of a total of some 330,000. The contingency which now developed had been a source of anxiety to the authorities even before the war, and various plans for dealing with it had been mooted. Some had suggested transferring the entire Japanese population en bloc to the United States in time of war, regardless of the difficulties of transport and accommodation which this drastic expedient involved. Another proposal was to form a concentration camp in the island of Niihau, although it is hard to see how such a vast multitude could have been housed and fed in such a restricted area. In the end, the views of the local officials prevailed, and the Japanese were allowed to remain undisturbed at their occupations, which, being mainly agricultural and commercial, were in large measure essential to the economic welfare of the other inhabitants. If only the importation of arms had been prevented, there is no reason to suppose that any trouble would have occurred. But when thousands of able-bodied aliens with rifles in their possession are at large in a country which is at war with their own, it is only a question of time and opportunity before an explosion takes place. The opportunity occurred in connection with the arrangements for training recruits drafted to Hawaii. 2 battalions of infantry had been stationed in temporary barracks erected at a spot 5 miles to the northeast of Honolulu. Their arms, instead of being near at hand during the night, were piled in a building distant some 100 yards from their sleeping quarters. Sentries were posted, but being new to military life, these were not as alert as veterans would have been. It is impossible to acquit certain officers of culpable negligence in failing to make better arrangements for the safety of their station. The result of this supineness was that an armed body of Japanese, numbering several thousands, surprised the barracks on the night of May 17th. They began by seizing the sentries at the armory and taking possession of the weapons there. This done, the main portion of the barracks was surrounded and an entrance forced. Aroused from sleep and without arms, few offered much resistance, and those who did so were shot down without mercy, among the victims being the senior officer, Colonel Landauer, who thus paid for his carelessness with his life. So well had the Japanese plans been laid that not a man escaped to spread the alarm. The prisoners, confined under a strong guard, were marched away into the hills. Following on this successful coup, the main body of insurgents took the road to Honolulu. They were organized on military lines, with Japanese Army Reserve officers in charge of sections. On the way, they were joined by contingents from other districts, and a series of positions in the central portion of the city, commanding the main approaches from the harbor, were occupied. Next morning, the resident American population awoke to find their streets invaded by an enemy who seemed to have sprung out of the ground. The troops in the island, numbering over 10,000, were not all assembled in a single place, but were scattered in various directions. The largest body was at Schofield Barracks, 20 miles away, in the center of the island, and found themselves surrounded by insurgents who had torn up the railway line and cut all telegraph and telephone wires. Other detachments were at Forts Weaver and Kamehameha, at the entrance to Pearl Harbor, at Fort Shafter, to the northwest of Honolulu, at Forts Armstrong, DeRussy, and Ruger to the southeast between the city and Diamond Head, and at a new magazine on the slopes of Mount Kanehuanui, about 10 miles north of Honolulu. With the enemy holding the center of communications, including the telephone exchange and railroad depot, the concentration of these troops was no easy task. Several of the camps which had been formed around the forts had been attacked, but their sentries seemed to have been vigilant, as nowhere had the rebels gained a foothold, though they still surrounded the forts in unknown strength. In Forts Armstrong and DeRussy, which are practically in Honolulu, there were barely 2,000 men, and not all of these were combatants. The guns were mostly disposed with a view to repelling an enemy attack from seaward, and in any case it did not seem advisable to shell the city except as a last resort. A fast launch was dispatched to Pearl Harbor to request assistance from the warships there. Pending the arrival of help, all available men were employed in driving off the detachments of Japanese in the vicinity of the two forts. This done, an advance was made along the streets leading towards the center of the city. Firing was incessant until both rebels and defenders learned by experience the folly of wasting ammunition. As the day wore on, both sides were reinforced, the Japanese by further contingents from distant villages, the Americans by landing parties from the warships. But it was only in the late afternoon that General McVie, the officer commanding in Oahu, judged himself strong enough to make a general attack. Roofs were lined with riflemen and machine gunners, and the warships were ordered to throw shells into certain prominent buildings known to be occupied by the enemy. A large portion of the fleet had left on a cruise the day before, but about a dozen ships were brought round from Pearl Harbor. While their fire caused considerable structural damage, casualties among the Japanese were few, owing to the skill with which they took advantage of every bit of cover. An American bayonet charge was more successful, and after a short hand-to-hand fight, the enemy positions were stormed. But on following the rebels across the open ground behind the buildings, the Americans found themselves enfiladed by a murderous fire from barricades and trenches at right angles to their line of advance, and were obliged to retreat. On regaining the shelter of the buildings they had just quitted, the plan of attack was reorganized, and while some kept the rebels busy with a steady fire, other parties spread out on either flank to take them in the rear. These movements were not executed without heavy casualties, and at the close of the day it was felt that other methods must be devised if the enemy was to be turned out of his positions without long and arduous trench warfare. The situation was saved by the arrival in port that night of a transport carrying a complete tank section. The tanks were of a light and handy type, eminently suitable for such an emergency. They were brought ashore without delay, gangs working all through the night to complete their discharge and assembly. Fortunately, their crews had been embarked in the same ship, so the necessary trained personnel was not lacking. On the following day, they led the advance with complete success, for the Japanese, taken altogether by surprise, were evidently disheartened by this unexpected diversion. Bursts of machine gun fire from the tanks broke up every attempt to rally, and the victory was rendered complete by the arrival of strong reinforcements from Fort Shafter, whose garrison had been relieved by a body of troops and seamen marched overland from Pearl Harbor. These made a flank attack on the retreating Japanese, who now broke and fled in various directions. Their retirement was covered by a series of fires which broke out simultaneously, having evidently been kindled to delay pursuit. Several streets were involved in this conflagration, which added considerably to the heavy bill for damages caused by the revolt. Many of the Japanese wounded perished miserably in the burning houses. This marked the turning point of the insurrection, and though the last spark of rebellion was not quenched until some weeks later, it never again assumed dangerous proportions. At the time, this truth was not fully realized, and as soon as the fire had been mastered and order restored, strong detachments patrolled the city to guard against the possibility of renewed attack in the night. Next day, steps were taken to reconquer the rest of the island, which appeared to be largely in the hands of the enemy. The garrison of Schofield Barracks, having driven off their assailants and repaired the railroad, were now in communication with Pearl Harbor, and with this aid, systematic arrangements were made to round up the rebels. On the previous day, a series of heavy explosions from the direction of Mount Kaneohe had caused grave misgivings as to the safety of the magazine there. It was now ascertained that Lieutenant Logan, the Coast Artillery officer in charge of this depot, had for many hours maintained a stubborn resistance to the assaults of a strong force of insurgents, who finally burst their way in by sheer weight of numbers. Although severely wounded, Lieutenant Logan contrived to ignite a train which had been laid in readiness and blew up the whole magazine, killing some hundreds of Japanese and injuring many more. This desperate act completely wrecked the plans of the rebels, who had counted on seizing the large quantity of rifles and ammunition stored in the magazine. There is no doubt that by his heroic action, Logan appreciably hastened the end of the revolt. In the other islands, where fewer weapons were available, the outbreak was not so serious. At Hilo, the largest town in the group after Honolulu, the disturbances only amounted to rioting. In fact, the movement was manifestly aimed at the American naval and military establishments in Oahu. In the hills, the Japanese insurgents contrived to maintain themselves for some 2 or 3 months by a form of guerrilla warfare scarcely distinguishable from brigandage, and the American War Department has placed it on record that the new military formations derived invaluable experience from the operations involved in the suppression of these dying embers of revolt. All Japanese captured with arms in their hands were deported to Panama and employed as laborers in the Canal Zone. Those who surrendered voluntarily within a certain period were dealt with more leniently. The many thousands of Japanese still left in Hawaii were segregated as far as possible and kept under surveillance by the military police. A court of inquiry, which sat at Pearl Harbor to probe into the origin of the revolt, found no positive evidence of outside instigation, though many prisoners quoted the ringleaders as having declared that they were acting under the orders of the Japanese government. A Japanese farmer named Morimoto, who had been captured while leading an attack upon Fort Ruger, assured the examining officers that the rising was planned to coincide with the arrival of a Japanese army of invasion, of whose coming the insurgents had been secretly apprised. This witness, it is true, bore a dubious character, and although he stuck to his evidence under severe cross-examination, the court appears to have remained skeptical. Another witness, named Soto, who had also been captured with arms in his hands, flatly contradicted Morimoto and insisted with considerable vehemence that the revolt had been planned from beginning to end by certain Japanese residents of Hawaii. In the opinion of several officers present in the court, Soto's vigorous denial of Japanese official complicity in the plot was overdone, though there was no means of testing his statements. The only other fact bearing upon the question is a reference in a book published at Tokyo a few months after the war. Its author, Captain Amakasu, a former naval officer, speaks vaguely of a projected expedition against Hawaii, the date given coinciding with that of the actual revolt. This expedition, Captain Amakasu states, was not proceeded with, as our scouts were unable to obtain the intelligence which was essential to the success of the undertaking. But, he adds, matters had already gone so far that warships and transports were assembling at Yokosuka for the voyage to Hawaii, and the plan was canceled only 10 days before the convoy was due to sail. In view of this testimony, it is impossible to dismiss the suspicion that the Tokyo government had some share in kindling the flames of rebellion. It would, in any case, have been a perfectly legitimate action from their point of view, for the creation of domestic embarrassments for an enemy state is one of the most time-honored methods of waging war. The rising might, of course, have proved a far graver affair than it actually turned out to be. Even as it was, many American lives and much valuable property had been sacrificed. Nor was the trouble without effect on the general military situation, for it delayed by at least 3 weeks the sailing of the expedition to Truk, and to that extent may be said to have prolonged the war. The expedition, which finally sailed from Pago Pago on June 18th, consisted of 4,000 picked troops with machine guns and field artillery. The troop transports, escorted by 2 divisions of destroyers and the aircraft carrier Wright, pursued a route which as far as possible avoided all islands of importance, leaving the Ellis and Gilbert groups out of sight to the north, and Fiji and the Solomons to the south. 2 strong squadrons of fast cruisers, each accompanied by an aircraft carrier, kept station some 20 miles ahead and to the northward of the transports, while 40 miles astern came the main battle fleet with its attendant destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries. So large an assemblage of vessels could not be expected to cross even such a vast ocean as the Pacific without being sighted, but by the formation adopted, the presence of the transports was effectually screened. Indeed, the only ships which caught a glimpse of the expedition were a British cruiser bound from the Solomon Islands to Fiji and a merchant steamer carrying phosphates from Nauru. The former only reported what she had seen to the British Admiralty, while the merchant vessel, being without radio gear, had no opportunity of disclosing the news until she reached Sydney a fortnight later, by which time it was too late for any harm to be done. The expedition covered the distance of 3,000 miles from Tutuila to Truk in 10 days, the average speed being rather below 13 knots. A certain amount of bad weather was encountered, which lengthened the voyage by a day or 2. Eventually, however, the islands were reached without misadventure, and the landing, which took place on June 28th, was quite peaceful, no resistance being offered by the 2 or 3 Japanese officials who represented their government. It is doubtful whether the native inhabitants of these remote islands appreciated that a war was in progress, nor would it have interested them if they had known. During the voyage, radio signals were reduced to a minimum, but once the island was occupied, full details were transmitted to Honolulu and thence to Washington in order that further preparations might proceed without delay. Since it was desirable that the enemy should be kept in the dark until the last possible moment, no intimation of the seizure of Truk was given out in the United States. So far as could be ascertained, Japanese cruisers were not in the habit of visiting Truk, but to guard against a surprise visit by enemy ships, the strictest possible watch was kept by airplanes, flights of which relieved each other in patrolling the group of islands. 4 of the fastest cruisers were held ready with steam in their boilers, in case it should prove necessary to run down and destroy an intruder, and shortly after the landing had been effected, all ships were refueled from the attendant oilers and colliers. Long afterwards, it was discovered that the expedition had narrowly missed running into the Japanese South Sea Squadron under Rear Admiral Kokuyama, which had called at Ponape on a cruise from the Philippines to Jaluit in the Marshall Archipelago the day before the descent on Truk, so that the bad weather which delayed the U.S. fleet was a blessing in disguise. The Truk or Hogolu Islands, which had thus become an advanced war base of the United States Navy, constitute the largest group in the Carolines, and were among the ex-German insular territories which fell to Japan under the Versailles Mandate. The dozen or more basaltic islands of the group form, as it were, the jagged rim of a great lagoon, some 40 miles in length and about the same in breadth, studded with rocky islets. This lagoon is accessible by 6 or more navigable passages, each deep enough for the heaviest battleships, though patches of shoal water and the strong tide render it necessary to proceed with caution. Etten Harbor, the principal settlement and seat of the Japanese administration, is located between Etten and Dublon Islands. The passage into the harbor is clearly marked by pole beacons, which the Japanese had omitted to remove on the outbreak of war. The lagoon itself, as Rear Admiral Harper had reported, was found to provide anchorage facilities for the entire fleet, and though there were not a few submerged rocks and areas of foul ground, the clear water enabled these dangers to be avoided by keeping a sharp lookout from each masthead when conning the ships to their berths. So far as natural advantages were concerned, it would have been difficult to find a place more admirably suited to the purposes of the expedition. Why the Japanese had neglected to take even the most elementary precautions against the seizure of Truk will always remain a mystery. True, there were so many islands in the South Seas which lay exposed to a sudden coup that the protection of all would have been physically impossible, but the geographical situation of Truk was such as to endow it with obvious strategic importance, and the failure to provide the simplest defenses, there was not even a long-range radio station, was an error for which Japan was to pay dearly. The easy and bloodless seizure of this valuable position stood in marked contrast to the abortive expedition against the Bonins. But the whole history of successful warfare is largely a record of initial mistakes having been retrieved by the wisdom born of painful experience, and this war was to be no exception to the rule.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.